So my thanks go to Nikolas Papadimitriou and to Yorgos Sanidas for their invitation to present the different processes used by Greek craftsmen in order to obtain bronze items, particularly bronze sculptures and vases. Let's say that the medium was beeswax. Bronze is said to be binary when it is an alloy of copper and tin. It is ternary if lead is added to the alloy. This addition of lead depended on the period and region. Copper and tin ores came mostly from abroad. They were melted down in the workshops. The addition of tin lowered the melting point of the bronze, 1083 degrees Celsius, and made the alloy more fluid. A good bronze alloy, if we go back to the words of Dion Chrysostomus, contain, as it seems, around 10% tin. The first metal votive offerings were not made of bronze, but of a natural copper arsenic alloy. Bronze is a generic term, but without an analysis of its elemental composition, it is impossible to know if we are dealing with a bronze or not, and some specialists recommend talking about copper alloys instead. The first real bronzes, alloys of copper and tin, appeared in Greece in the second half of the 8th century BC, at the end, let's say, of the so-called geometric period. Among the oldest ex-votos are animal figures and women's circles, just like the one you have on screen, small metal objects cast solid, echoing children's Play-Doh, modeling clay. The principle is based on modeling a prototype directly in wax in the manner of modeling clay. You can feel your fingers modeling the piece without the need of hammering or incisions after casting, so a rough cast object. The principle is to model the desired figure in wax, so you have the drawing on screen, build in wax a network of gates connected to a funnel, and vents for the evacuation of gases, enclose the whole in a casting mold, heat the assembly to allow the wax to be melted down and evacuated, and then pour the molten metal into a funnel connected to gates. We can understand the process thanks to the miscasts found at Olympia. They were dumped into the earth to fill in the wells dug to water the visitors, whether spectators of the games or devotees. They were discarded along with decommissioned ex-votos, even though metal was in short supply. Was it to respect divine will? We don't know. It was not written. Here the wax model moved and was crushed in the casting mold. The molten metal cooled too quickly and broke. It was a fountain casting to bring the molten metal to the top of the female heads. On the right, you have a miscast, a more recent casting failure, a bronze horse from the late geometric period. The molten metal cooled too quickly, never reached the legs. The miscast is compared with a well-achieved Corinthian ex-voto, illustrating the craftsman's new understanding of the possibilities offered by metal, hammering following annealing, decorative incisions. Not all figures were freestanding, but could also adorn utensils. Among the most imposing ex-votos of the geometric period were tripods with hammered cauldrons, which were held on 3 legs by rivets. The vessels, hammered and therefore thinner and more fragile, have often disappeared or are only preserved in fragmentary state. Modern reconstruction is here on the left side of the slide. On the slide are two strut figures on either side of a tripod handle with hammered bowl, identified as representing Theseus and the Minotaur, the first illustration of the myth. When cast solid, as here, figures were relatively small, and here the Minotaur is kept in the Louvre because it came with the Campana collection in 1861, and Theseus figure is kept in Athens, the National Archaeological Museum. But then, if you look on the right, you see a more recent statuette of a flutist from Samos, showing the limits of the process. It is a solid cast, almost 42 centimeter high, dated to around 530 BC, and it bears witness to the accidents that were likely to occur randomly at the time of casting. The face, on which we can still make out the leather straps of the forbea that held the double instrument over the mouth, is chaotic. The right arm awkwardly positioned, the tunic punctuated with small cavities. However, the work conceived by the craftsman must have been particularly elegant after its finishing in wax. If we disregard the defects in the bronze and observe the naturalness of the pose, the treatment of the musician's body to be seen under the fabric of the long chiton, the smooth areas of the drapery contrasting with the accumulation of folds between the legs and the fall of the colpos over the belt. The challenge facing craftsmen was to reduce the amount of metal required by designing hollow bronzes. Bird-shaped pendants, probably Corinthian, one of which was unearthed at Delphi, bear witness to this new research, probably as early as the second half of the 8th century BC. The birds, the one from Delphi measures 13.8 centimeters in height, were fashioned in wax around a ball of clay that acted as a core. When working on larger, necessarily hollow pieces, the craftsman first worked the clay, shaping the core. Here you can see it with oblique hatching, then added wax to the core to obtain the desired shape. It was without being able to control the thickness of the wax. Then the craftsman built in wax a network of gates connected to the funnel and vents for the evacuation of gases. A new step was to place pins, you can see pins here, for instance, through the wax to lock them into the core. These pins, usually made of iron, but sometimes of bronze, were called chaplets. They were rectangular in section. The heads were left exposed, so when the casting mold, here is the casting mold, investment was built around the hole, they would hold the core in position after the melting out of the wax. After heating the hole to allow the wax to be melted down and evacuated, then returned it in order to get the funnel on top, and then pour the molten metal into a funnel connected to gates. After having broken the investment, the figure appeared with chaplet and the network of gates, funnel, and vents. The chaplets were removed, the channels cut. But the innovative process was that of indirect lost wax hollow casting. which was perfected in the second half of the 6th century BC. This process was based on the prior creation of a model, a prototype, most often in clay. This original model was cut into parts that were to be cast separately, then joined together. The next step was the taking of an impression, that is, the manufacture of a clay or plaster master mold, which was taken from the original model and lined into a layer of beeswax. The wax was poured in, brushed on, or applied in slabs. Traces of the process used to introduce the wax into the mold can be seen sometimes on the inner wall of the bronze. Brush marks, drips. On this particular example, the wax was poured into the master mold, to which a back and forth movement was applied, and the excess wax was evacuated. Then a liquid clay core was poured inside the master mold, lined with wax. Then the master mold was removed, and this was done for each separate joining section. These beeswax sections of the statue were reassembled into a working model which could be detailed by the bronze worker, the sculptor himself in classical period. The bronze maker moved closer to the maker of clay figurines and vase figures and became truly plastes, as the creative gesture came under the heading of modeling. This word plastes was used by Plutarch to describe Polycletus. In the 5th century BC, bronze sculptors were modelers, and this happened twice, when they modeled the clay prototype and when they added wax details such as curl of hair, beard on the wax working model. The thickness of the middle walls, equivalent to that of wax, was now reduced and regular. It is this control that limited casting accidents. The model and the master molds were preserved. After this first step, the wax working model was cut again, and the next step were identical to those which were described for the direct process: metallic chaplets, network of gates, funnel, vents, clay investment, and so on. Pausanias, the 2nd century writer, ascribed the invention of bronze casting to Theodoros and Roikos. The literary insistence on the personalities of the two Samians, celebrated by ancient tradition as architects, engineers, and bronze makers around and after the middle of the 6th century BC, is in itself indicative of an underlying reality closer to the indirect process. Casting failures and workshop waste confirm that the Heraion of Samos, a sanctuary of long-distance contacts and exchanges, notably with the more technologically advanced Egyptian and Oriental civilizations, was a place where metallurgy was practiced. It was certainly through contact with Ionian potters who had been using clay molds since the 7th century BC and local terracotta figurine makers that Samian bronze workers learned to use bivalve molds to make their statuettes, molds that could be preserved. The production of figure in clay or wax was based on a common know-how, and it is likely that craftsmen worked in close proximity to one another, since the same molds could be used for both clay and wax. Several small Samian bronzes, partially hollow castings, made around 530-520 BC, provide information on the construction of wax model figures. This was Helmut Kyriela's work, and you can see X-rays after Guerric publication of a large statuette of an offering-bearing Kouros, unearthed in the sanctuary of Hera before the First World War. It showed that it is partially hollow and composed of several separately modeled elements. The legs, feet, forearms, hands, and sex are full wax models, which were added to the body. The head was obtained from two halves. The craftsman used a bivalve mold from the front and back of the body, from the neck to the knees and elbows. Profile X-rays of the body reveal two almost vertical lines in the core, one lighter, the other darker, converging at navel level and corresponding to the mold's suture. Once adjusted, the two halves were removed, the two partial molds were removed, and the wax smoothed from the outside, the suture being more successful on the left than on the right, according to the different thickness of the bronze on radiographs. The thinning of the metal on either side of the chin would also provide evidence of sutures in the wax between head and neck. A twin to the previous Kouros was unearthed during the 1984 excavation in the AEGEAN. However, it has one notable difference, a dedicatory inscription, Smikros Iri, engraved vertically on the left leg. The craftsman reused the same partial molds, the dimension taken by Helmut Kereyelas show that they are identical. So to produce several casts in the manner of terracotta figurine makers, the wax model was modified before casting in response to a request from a pilgrim who wished to dedicate the figure to the goddess. Whether Smikros was looking at the finished bronze model, a wax model, or the original prototype, which could have been made of ivory, wood, wax, or terracotta, isn't clear. But this discovery sheds new light on the duplication of similar offering by Samian bronze makers in the third quarter of the 6th century. As the clay in the partial master molds had to be dried and fired, the proportion of the original model must have been slightly higher. The mastery of indirect lost wax casting, which implies the prior production of a model, usually in clay, is evoked in an exceptional way, so rare are representations of bronze craftsmen at work around 470 BC on a red-figured Attic onokoe. Athena Ergane, protector of craftsmen, is shown modeling a horse in clay. To emphasize the very act of modeling, the horse's body and the clods of earth at the goddess' feet and in her hand have been reloaded with slip, creating a surface irregularity that is particularly sensitive in grazing light, contrasting with the figure of the goddess and the decorative elements. A true iconographic manifesto, the divine occupation is limited to the creative gesture of the modeler, the sculptor of the statue, when the clay is in the fingernail, to quote the words attributed by Plutarch to Polycletus, describing him as a plastus, as I said before, that is a modeler. I quote, this is the way the modeler, or plastus, Polycletus, said that the work is most difficult when the clay is in the fingernail. The female head, terracotta head, was once considered a prototype since it is solid, but then there are traces of paint and so it is not totally clear. Only this example to show you clay outer mold, the fineness of the first layer of the casting mold to preserve the surface of the wax model. So it was a state of liquid slip to follow the details and preserve the details made in wax. And you have on the left the fragment with the negative impression of a young black head, and on the right, the positive, the modern positive. The mastery of indirect lost wax casting seems to have become widespread throughout the Greek world before the end of the 6th century BC. The Zeus from Ugento, a large statuette measuring 71.8 centimeters in height, bears witness to this technique in around 530-520 BC. And moreover, you can see that the statuette is standing on a rectangular plinth, and there is a difference in the alloy. The plinth is made of a ternary alloy composed with 20% of lead. And here you have the statuette again and the composition with only 3.6% of lead. And here is one of the radiographs that was published by de Grassi in 1981 and studied by Benoît Mille from the laboratory of the French Museum, the C2RMF. And it's very interesting because you can see how thin the walls are, so telling that this Zeus was made by the indirect method. So we understand that southern Italy was, and Magna Graecia was great activity before the end of the 6th century BC. And I wanted to show you quickly this volute crater from Vix. On the left side, you have only one handle of a volute crater, which is kept in the Louvre. The counterpart is in southern France, in Nîmes, and because it was of course, the vase itself was not preserved, and these two handles were sold, and the one from the Louvre arrived in the Louvre in 1887. And on the right, you have the most impressive vase ever found, and it was discovered in the Vix tomb in January 1953, a tomb linked to the early Iron Age Alsatian oppidum fortified settlement of Mont-Lassois in France. The tomb belongs to one of the very last burial mounds built at the beginning of the 5th century BC. The tumulus was of 40 meters in diameter, and it covered burial chamber approximately 3 meters square. It was a monumental tomb with chariot. In the center of the tomb, there was the body of a 4-wheeled chariot, inside which had been placed the burial of a woman of around 35 years old. She had jewels made of gold, amber, schist, bronze, and iron, and the funerary deposit comprised an imposing drinking service in metalware and ceramics, among which this large crater with a capacity of 1,100 liters. On its lid were silver fiale and 2 Attic bowls, and next to the crater there were 3 bronze basins and a bronze oinokoe that had fallen to the ground. Funerary equipment linked to an import trade in luxury goods of Greco-Etruscan origin. So it's important to understand that these tombs show the relations between the ancient Celtic world and classical Mediterranean civilizations. There were different sets of objects belonging to 2 distinct chronological periods separated by 1 generation. The oldest group mainly comprises exceptional pieces of banqueting metalware, such as the Curator, which was made in a specialized workshop in Magna Graecia. One of the large basins was an Etruscan production from the third quarter of the 6th century. The four-wheeled chariot falls into the second category. So we have to understand these luxury Mediterranean metalware as prestigious gifts adapted to the Celtic barbarian clients. The crater may represent an attempt to transcribe a classical Greek object, namely a vessel for mixing wine and water, and to adapt it to a foreign environment in which increasingly large quantities of drink, of wine, were mobilized for distribution by the Celtic ruling classes as a sign of their social prestige and political power. Was it in exchange for medals or slaves? We don't know. The body and neck were hammered in a single piece. The two halves of the lips, the handles, and the applique on the neck were cast, perhaps also the foot. And to understand this technique, most other vases were cast like eggs, quite thick eggs for the body itself, and then hammered from the inside to enlarge the vase and to make the walls thinner. And here you have one applique, a cow, which was decorating another volute crater from Illyria, from Trebeniște, now in the Archaeological Museum of Sofia. And you can see it was at the time of the restoration that the applique from the river side show fingerprints. And so we can understand that the wax was applied in the mold. So the indirect method of lost wax techniques alone would not have been sufficient if not being combined with another technique developed at the same time, the technique of flow fusion welding. This second technique was based on a high level of empirical know-how. Bronze makers were able to weld two sections together, head, arms, legs, by casting in between an alloy identical to their own, that is, melting at the same temperature, something that never happens today. These craftsmen, who had only their eyes to judge the proper moment by the color of the molten bronze, and who had to face the molten metal with no real protection, are admired by today's founders. The process made it possible to produce bronze works of natural size or slightly larger than human size, a qualitative jump illustrated by the statue that I show you on screen, beginning with a charioteer, which is a statue of 1.80 centimeter. And then you have the two warriors, A and B, from Riace Marina, close to 2 meters. Then the Piraeus Athena, 2.35 meters. And then the term ruler from the Quirinal, and it's 2 meters 22. So, and if you look back to statues from the 6th century or beginning of the 5th, they are smaller. And so there is a real invention which was used by bronze workers. Another example is the bronze god found in the sea near Cape Artemision, northern island of Evia, and it's 2.09 2 meters and 9 centimeters. So this technique was identified through the study of Riace bronzes and published in 1984 by Edilberto Formigli, who is one of the best scholars concerning the manufacture of Greek bronzes. You can see that here you have the wrist of Riace A, and on the edge you have this half elliptical shape, and it is in this vaschette, as is said, that the molten metal was just poured. And the side A of the foundry cup would illustrate this step at the beginning of the 5th century BC of welding the hand and head to the body of a statue. And it was proposed by Carol Matouche and then again by Benoit Mille. Here, we will see with the furnace the preparatory melting of the alloy, the secondary metal, to join these different parts. Because if you look at this, you have still the line here, and you can see precisely that the way the join is made at the very middle of the neck is precisely what we observe at the same period a little bit later on bronzes. So here you can see when we began to work on this extraordinary mission of study under the edges of the Greek effort of antiquities from Phokida, and then the French school in Athens and the Louvre. The first mission was in 2017, and we tried to detect what was already to be seen and what we have to study, what type of means we have to add to study everything. And then we could see that here on the neck, precisely, we saw this ellipse. So we knew that one of the things we had to prove, we had to prove that it was the indirect method, but moreover, that the joints were made with these particular methods of flow fusion welding. So now some examples. As said previously, classical sculptors intervene several times during the manufacturing of a bronze statue, creating the clay model and adding later plastic details in the wax model. The fact that they combine indirect lost wax casting and solid lost wax casting indicate that the model on which master molds was taken was not totally completed. Certain high relief details were worked directly in wax on the wax model, then removed, cast separately, and welded onto the bronze head or the different parts. This made it possible to vary the composition of the metal. Edilberto Formigli's proposal in the early 1980s about the cast solid mouth of Riace warrior A is totally accepted since then. He gave a convincing explanation for the mustache, partially concealing the upper lip, which had in consequence a different color because it is made from copper alloy richer in tin. This technical prowess speaks to the skills of the bronze workers who had mastered the techniques of lost wax casting around 460 BC. Formigli was in his understanding by a detached solid cast mouth with a fastening hook at the back found at Olympia. The unalloyed copper mouth was cast necessarily before the head, and this combination of hollow, indirect, and solid casting. And on the right, you have a mold for producing wax lips from a permanent workshop south of the Parliament in Athens, used during the second half of the 5th century, beginning of the 4th century. The excavation were in the early 1990s, and this mold for wax lips was identified and published recently by Gerhard Zimmer in 2019. So I'm sure, well, I can imagine that he will speak again about this extraordinary discovery he made. After the placement of the mouth in unalloyed copper, the very plastic curls were modeled and added in wax, then removed, cast separately, and reattached, soldered to the head with a flow fusion welding process. And here you have this detail, it's warrior B, and you see again the mouth, copper mouth, concealed, partially concealed by the mustache in another alloy. Bronze sculptors used mostly metalworking techniques such as inlaying and plating to add polychrome effects to their works, with unalloyed metals such as copper, silver, gold, or alloyed metals, which were added to the general hue of the base copper alloy. This is the reason why bronzes appeared very different from marble or limestone sculptures and from terracotta figurines, where color was applied according to the painting practices of the time. The polychromy was particularly concentrated on faces. And once again, in his pioneering work on the Riace warriors, published in the early 1980s, and later on in 2013, after the third campaign of conservation conducted between 2009-2011, and 2011 formally revealed the complexities of the coloring techniques of on the bronze heads. At the end of the 6th century and during the early decades of the 5th century BC, the eyebrows of large bronzes were inlaid with red copper. The eyes of bronze statues were made separately and inserted from the outside into the empty sockets. The eyeballs were encased in quadrangular boxes of hammered copper sheet cut at one end to simulate eyelashes. They were held in places at the other end by claws and probably adhesive. A pair of life-size eyes in the Metropolitan Museum show you the appearance of the upper sheet with these cut at one extremity. And then the intervention during the recent additional cleaning of the head of Riace Warrior A made it possible to reveal the lacrimal caruncle of the right eye and to ascertain that it is a small pinkish stone. And since the charioteer's eyes are exceptionally well preserved, they were the ideal candidate for extremely thorough study. The eyes, if we describe the eye of the charioteer, the iris was made of chalcedony, the ring around the iris was basalt, the pupil obsidian, and the tear caruncle coral. These are the results which were given after the study of Benoît Mille, Ivan Coquinot, and Thomas Caligaro from the French laboratory, French Museum. And the polished eyes were acting like mirrors under the light. You can see here the impact of the light on the iris. There was an evolution attested at last at the end of the 4th century BC, and particularly the eyes of late 4th and 3rd century BC were exceptionally refined, though different in conception from previous ones. They were made of powdered glass mixed with different chemical elements. Chemical analysis has revealed on Sophie's eyes that the green color of the ring around the iris was obtained by mixing iron and copper with powdered glass. The irises were translucent because there was a space between the eye's depth and the cavity they were set into, allowing light to shine through the material. Vitreous material gave the eyes a kind of liquid and shining appearance. And to my opinion, I think that there was the same kind of research at the same period when you look at a detail from Aios Athanasios Macedonian tomb with the same blue liquidity from the eyes of one of the guardians of the tomb, like tears. If we go back to the charioteer and to understand the metallic composition, the charioteer's bronze was a copper alloy with tin, with 10% tin. And the headband was bronze, with copper and tin. The fillets here are made of copper, red copper, from two different batches. And the meander and cross, something we discovered the first year of our mission, they are inlaid with tin, which is totally surprising, and it's unique indeed. And we were very interested when we studied these fillets, because as you can see, they appear to be black, and we were hoping to have testimony of an ancient patina, but no, nothing at all. It's only copper without sulfur, without gold, and without silver. The mouth made of copper, and as you said, the eyebrows, and the teeth made of silver. And if we go a little bit further, you have this cord here, which was made of copper, and then the belt made of an alloy, which was there were two type of alloy for the reins and the belt with 4 to 6% of tin. And so we can understand, and moreover, that there was a polychromy with horses, because we were fortunate to have, since we had the authorization to make few samples. So we have a fragment of a horse's tail, with part of the joining secondary metal and of the body of the horse. And we can see that the alloy is different. So we have to imagine that the quadriga, the 4 horses, were of different, tiny, subtle, it was subtle, but different colors too. And this slide is only to show you that something happened, and it was Claude Rollet who stressed it, between what we know about statuettes from before and after 440, let's say the Parthian time. Before 440, it seemed that statuettes were made by bronze workers who were artists and who could create large statues as well. They were just trying to understand the movement, the position, and so they were free to work. Later on, it was a little bit different, and on the right you have this Heracles from Mount Rhodopus and the giant, here called Poseidon Jameson. Here they were echoing the large creation of the same time. So it was not totally the same. It is difficult to get an accurate idea of the original color of bronzes when we observe the surviving statues. Their current appearance is deceiving because natural corrosion processes, due to being exposed to the elements during antiquity or being buried for centuries, or because of an extended stay in the sea, altered their surfaces. We must turn to other types of testimony that help us to understand how they looked like. From the first stage of scraping the cast skin to the final polishing of surfaces to accentuate their shine, bronze workers used a variety of abrasive materials and tools, emery ground to a powder and mixed with oil, stones of different hardnesses, first coarse and then finer and finer up to pumice stone, and metal scrapers. The effect of light were empirically known to ancient sculptors, who were well aware that bronze still has a matte, golden appearance, not a shiny one, after the action of pumice stone. Craftsmen completed the polishing process as depicted in the foundry on the foundry cup by using a metal scraper. This tool, removing fine shavings, produced notches of varying depth, oriented according to the way it was guided. The scraper also vibrated to create small depressions perpendicular to the notches. These ripples were so dense that they generated significant light diffraction effects, accentuating the three-dimensionality of the works at location chosen by the craftsman. When they left the workshop, after final polishing and the application of a translucent layer of bitumen or pine resins diluted in olive oil to protect them from the corrosion, their hue tended towards a yellow or pinkish gold, depending on the higher or lower percentage of tin in the copper alloy. And here, quickly to show you, it's very rare to have a representation of bronze statues, one from the end of the 5th century, the second one from the first quarter of the 4th century. On the left, the painter of Talos depicted a bronze robot, the giant made by Hephaestus, and offered to King Minos to protect Crete. And here the robot is seized by Dioscuri. His metallic body is highlighted in white and a reddish-brown varnish that emphasizes his muscles, bone structure, and facial features, creating the illusion of volume and a shine that changes with the light. And the fragment of the Tarentum chalice crater attributed to the painter of the birth of Dionysus provides further evidence of the appearance of bronzes. A dark-haired Apollo sits outside his temple. The bronze statue's hair and body are of the same golden yellow color. The painter used a diluted red-brown varnish to treat the details of the hair and the contours of the muscles. The chromatic perception of the ancients was different from ours. They were sensitive to the shimmer, sparkle, vibration, and intensity of light, to changing brightness and to values of lightness and darkness, without which colors could not be defined. They were looking for the shine and brilliance of metal. And here on this slide, you have Peter Gerke's modern reconstruction in 1991 on the middle. He had a plaster cast of the castle Apollo on the left, completely covered in metal foil to restore the color and brilliance of the original, possibly the Apollo Panopios by Phidias or the Apollo Alexikakos by Calamis. And on the right, you have the aspect, the appearance of warrior A. And here, it's only to show you with the term ruler from the Quirinal, the difference with the introduced by the treatment of the hair, of the beard, And we can imagine that the light was not acting the same as on the smooth surface of the skin. And this, I think, is very important to understand what was the palette of bronzes. On the left, you have an unalloyed copper with no tin, and it's only pinkish. And then you have on the third line a 10% tin alloy, copper alloy, which was the color of most bronze. So the polychromy was very subtle, and the ancients really thought the brightness and brilliance of metal, but everything was very subtle. And on the right, you have on the fourth step, you have 15% tin, and this is the composition of this exceptional masterpiece, which is kept in the Archaeological Museum of Thessaloniki. And it's such work, as Berry Bashara proposed and showed, it was probably made in Athens around 370 BC, and it is very, very high, more than 90 centimeters. And there are inlays, silver inlays, some figures added, attached in the round, and we have to understand how this kind of vase was made, partially cast, of course, the figures were cast, but then hammered as well. And it is an example of this art of torotike, the art of hammering a thin sheet or metal or metal wall in wax or clay to create a relief from the inside out. Once again, the Sophie's head to show you the coating. Because unfortunately, the yellowish brightness of a bronze lasted for a relatively short period of time, for the metal is unstable and corrodes quickly. It was necessary then, as I said, to try to slow down the alteration process, that is to say, the natural corrosion of the copper alloy, which is inevitable because it's due to the exposure to air and variation in humidity. The bronze alloy tarnished very quickly, an evolution that could happen only a few years after the manufacturing of the statue. This is why there were attempts to delay the onset of corrosion by coating bronze statues with bituminous substances or pine resin diluted in olive oil, as I said previously. And the head of Sophie III probably remained in the open air for only a short time before being buried a few meters from the front of the Odrysian ruler's cenotaph. As a result, the protective layer changed little before burial. This is what you see here. It is very thin and does not conceal at the base of the neck on the right the underlying traces left on the bronze by its original polishing. This thin translucent film was not intended to alter the bronze's rather pinkish incarnation between 6 to 9% tin, but rather to enhance the realism of the epidermis. While it is possible to restore the original hue of an antique bronze work on the basis of the elemental composition of the alloy, it is more difficult to judge its evolution only a few centuries after its creation. Works by 5th century BC sculptors such as Myro, Phidias, or Polycletus, or 4th century BC sculptors such as Lysippus, were certainly already in an intermediate state by the Hellenistic period, and this state would have led to a change in taste, dictated by the new aesthetic that the inevitable darkening of metal surfaces imposed. This phenomenon may explain the appearance before the end of the Hellenistic period of intentionally dark artificial patinas, as observed by, this was his hypothesis, Professor Halma in 1994 on the Salamis youth. And you have a fresco from Pompeii in the so-called Triclinium house, dated between 50 and 79, featuring a very dark, smaller than life-size figure resting on a circular plinth. This is indeed a statue whose metallic skin reflects the light. So, patinas, very quickly, the first documented intentional patina, black patina in the Greek world, was identified on several bronzes found in the Madia shipwreck. The Madia wreck. These bronzes predate the end of the 2nd century BC according to the date of the shipwreck. A sulfur-based black glaze was found on a small number of statuettes and decorative elements. The left iris of one of the large dancing dwarf figures is a nail comprising 67% copper and 32% sulfur, which was patinated before being inserted into the eyeball. And so we have some information, such as this terracotta figurine from Smyrna, which is Hellenistic and may reflect the evolution in ancient bronzes. It is entirely covered in brown paint, with the exception of the eyes, whose brown irises stand out against the white enhanced eyeball. It is not gold-leafed, as were most of the figurine produced by Smyrna's choroplath between the end of the Hellenistic period and the 1st century of the Roman imperial period. So was this statuette figurine blackened to imitate the appearance of bronzes darkened by centuries of exposure, or because they were deliberately patinated? Craftsmen had also realized that they could produce a velvety, lustrous black patina by heat treatment with a luster close to that of enamel on the right. Such a patina, thicker and more uniform in color, can be seen on the surface of a balustrade element, a pillar with a satyr's head, which was studied by the laboratory of French Museum. You see the silver eyes, lips in red copper, which stand out against the dark background. The black color, made possible by the mastery of artificial patinas, produced rapidly by applying sulfur at high temperature, allowed for very strong contrast, and you have a number of medium-sized bronzes illustrating the new attraction of bronze makers and patrons to contrasting two colors, which is here in the middle, black and white, but sometimes three colors, black, white, and red on a Getty bronze. Another of these black patinas, even more fascinating, was the means of obtaining the Corinthian bronze of ancient texts. This fabulous alloy, which was discovered through the fortuitous fusion of bronze, gold, and silver, well, this is the legend, of course, during the sack of Corinth in 146 BC, hence its name, was sought after by the wealthiest Romans. It was described by the Egyptian Zosimus of Panopolis, an alchemist active in the 3rd century AD. This alloy did not corrode, and precisely because of the presence of a small quantity of gold and or silver, as demonstrated by the analysis and study of both the formation mechanism and the optical properties of the black layers, developed a deep, dense, dark, perennial patina. This was studied in the laboratory, French laboratory. The earliest known examples of Corinthian bronzes, that is black bronzes or black coppers if the alloy contains no tin, date from the 1st century AD at the earliest. The specimens identified up to now are mostly inlays, such as inlays, black inlays on this inkpot from Vaison-la-Romaine. You have the other part of the body with the aerotes, wings, and you have on the right a reconstruction of the color of this inkpot, which were the four colors so important for ancient people and said to have been on the palette of Apelles, the painter of the 4th century, the Greek painter of the 4th century BC. Of course, it was not true, but this is what was thought, and particularly by Pliny the Elder. There were few statuettes, but exceptionally, because this black bronze was difficult to be cast, and the results uneven, except that here you see that these two little figures, very small, you see 6 centimeters high, missing the legs, but it's very small. They are hollow cast, and there is a different alloy for the bust and for the mantle. And we know that this technique was known from the Egyptian at the beginning of the 2nd millennium BC. You have a crocodile from the Fayum, from the 12th dynasty, and it was very well done at that time. So where did the Egyptian learn this technique? It's Alexandra Jumla-Meyer and Paul Cradock studied these first examples, but you see, we can't go earlier in time. And but then the Greek scientists studied some of the objects too, and Mrs. Demakopoulou studied the Mycenaean daggers. And if you look at the different composition and alloy, you see that the surrounding was copper alloy with 5% tin, but then the very middle is black bronze. And in order to make a contrast for these lions, which are of two different gold alloys. So this technique disappeared with the end of the Mycenaean period and world, and seems to have reappeared in the Aegean world only during the Hellenistic time. Well, this is what the legend says, but we know that the pharaohs in Hellenistic were, of course, Greek pharaohs. And because the Egyptian never stopped doing black bronzes, they knew the technique. So across times, and when you read Homeric poems, you can recognize that one of the color, the alloy, which is called kyanos, was certainly this type of particular alloy with gold and or silver in it. We know only from items like the inkpot from Vaison-la-Romaine. And this, I will conclude telling that it is very important when you study a bronze, when you keep a bronze, when you unearth a bronze, to be aware that you can have some testimonies at the surface under the concretion. And it's important not to clean it drastically, but first of all to study and try to find some traces that can go back to such extraordinary techniques that were handled by Greek bronze workers. Thank you. Sorry, I've been a little bit long.